All right, it's 10:05, so I'm gonna go ahead and start. And so I am gonna do the next presentation. I'll be doing the disease management update. So I'm going to cover, if I can get this to move. So I'm going to talk about blast, stem rot and aggregate sheath spot, and then at the very end I have just one slide on kernel smut. So blast, we had a 2020 was a bad blast year. We saw a lot of blast, especially in the northern part of the valley, uh, Glenn County, Butte County, and some of the northern areas of Colusa County. And it's been 2 years in a row now. 2019 was bad as well, but 2020 was certainly worse. And so, just a quick review of blast. So, what are some of the things that favor blast? One is excess nitrogen, and you can see that clearly when you have nitrogen overlaps. Usually, those are places where you'll see blast develop. The small circles of all the plants dry down to the water level, and also draining the water. Even when you do very early drains, like if you're draining for stand establishment or if you're draining for a clincher application, those drains seem to favor the development of blast later on. When it comes to weather, leaf wetness, long periods of leaf wetness, that means free moisture on the surface of the leaves. So that's the dew that we usually see at night and in the mornings. And high nighttime temperatures are also favor blast. And I think that might be why we saw so much blast this past year. We had in June, we had several weeks where we saw very warm nights, and what that does is it allows the spores that are on the leaves to germinate quicker, and so they can germinate and then produce an infection before the dew evaporates in the morning. Um, and also, the smoke. We had the smoke from the fires. It was kind of late in the season, but uh, that might affect it in some fields. I did see quite a bit of blast that came late after the panicles were already filled and tipped, and in those cases the effect is not as bad because you already have a kernel that's been filling, but it's not the same as when you get the blast early and you get the whole panicle blanked out and then there's nothing there. So what are some of the strategies to manage blast is, keep an eye on your fertility. So nitrogen, use as much nitrogen as you need to maximize your yield, but make sure you're not putting anything extra. So um, assess the need for a top dress. That's going to be very important. Avoid draining. Like I said, draining seems to predispose the plants for more blast. Variety. So M205 and M209 were the ones that did the worst last year. They're more susceptible to blast. We have a new variety, M210, which is resistant, and I have a slide on that next. We have two fungicides that are registered for blast control. So we have Quadris, active ingredient is azoxystrobin, and then Stratego, the active ingredient is trifloxystrobin, and they're both good to control blast. The application timing, it's early heading, very early heading. Now, if you see leaf blast, so you can use leaf blast as an indication that you're going to have to do a treatment at heading. I visited several fields last year where growers and PCAs were wondering if they needed to do a treatment for the leaf blast. In general, I don't think it's a good idea to do a treatment when there's only, it's very limited, where you only have a few spots where you see the leaf blast. Um, but in some cases where you have large areas of leaf blast, uh, there might be a benefit of doing a treatment. What you're accomplishing is you're reducing the amount of spores that are going to be produced, And so you're reducing the amount of inoculum that's going to be available for later infections. And so that would be the benefit of doing leaf blast applications. One strategy that some growers and PCAs have is to just treat the headlands where these affected areas are. And so in that way, you don't have to treat the whole field, and you can still accomplish the reduction of inoculum levels. So that's something that you might want to consider. And so there's several things you have to take into consideration, like what's the price of rice going to be, how's the crop coming along, what is it looking like, to see if the investment of a leaf blast application is really necessary. But for certain, if you see leaf blast, I would consider a heading treatment for blast. And then blast is one of these diseases where you need to know what's going on in your area. You need to know if your neighbors have it, if the fields down the road have it, because if they do, chances are that those spores are going to move, and then you're going to end up with infections. So we have M210 this year, or since 2018 actually, but M210 is a blast-resistant variety. So it has a number of genes that confer resistance to blast. And so whenever I talk to PCAs and growers, the first question is, so how does it do? And M210, it's very similar to M206. They're almost twins. Genetically, they're 99.6% the same. And you can see here in this slide, their yield and other characteristics are very similar. So if you've grown M206, you know how M210 is going to behave. Now, a lot of the problem fields have been where growers had M209 or M205 that have a nice yield advantage, especially in the warmer areas of the valley where blast tends to be worse. So you have to take into consideration, if you grow M210 and your only problem is blast, then you won't need to do a treatment for blast. So that's going to be a savings, and maybe a savings of two treatments, and then weigh that against the yield advantage that you might get if you were growing M209. And so consider those things when you think about M210. Okay, so now I'm going to move into aggregate sheath spot and stem rot. So these are very common diseases. Every rice field in the valley probably has some level of them. It's usually one or the other. They compete with each other. So fields usually have more stem rot than aggregate sheath spot, and the other way around as well. But in some cases, these diseases can cause problems. And one question that I uh, get is, how much yield can these diseases really affect? And I didn't really. I couldn't answer that question. We really didn't have that data, but in the past few years, we've been doing a lot of fungicide trials, and we've generated some data. And so, but first, I want to show you this, which is the scale we use to rate our fungicide trials, and then we're going to use this to understand the yield reduction. And so, for both diseases, we have a scale that goes from 0 to 4, where 0 is no disease, and then as it gets worse, the score increases, and then the worst would be a number 4, where for stem rot, the tillers rotted through at the water level. For aggregate sheath spot, you have the lesions affecting the panicle, and then you have a blank panicle. So if we take all the fungicide trials that we've done in the past 4 years, and these have all been on medium grains, which respond very similarly to these two diseases. So we can kind of group them all. And then we took the trials where we found yield reductions. And so that was 8 trials for stem rot and 3 trials for aggregate sheath spot. And we were able to get an estimate or an average of yield reduction per 1 unit increase in severity. And so for stem rot, that's been 3%. For aggregate sheath spot, about a little over 3.5%. And so what this means is that as the severity of the disease increases, you start seeing an increase in on the yield reduction. And so when we're at the one level, you might see a yield reduction of about 3.5 percent or 4%. When we're at level two, then that becomes 6% or 7%. And they're both very similar. And so on, number three and four. Usually, what I've seen is that most fields are around one or less. Fields that are at level two, you can certainly detect the yield reduction in our trials. You know, we're dealing with small plots, so in a lot of the fields with a level two, that's when we start detecting benefits of using the fungicides. And if you have a field that's at level three or more, then you know that's something you're going to notice because your yield's going to be down quite a bit, and so that would be very noticeable. So very quickly, these two diseases, you know, interact quite a bit with fertility. So stem rot is favored by excess nitrogen, just like blast, but also by low potassium levels. And aggregate sheath spot is the same. It's not affected by nitrogen, but is affected by potassium. And so, you know, keep an eye on your on your fertility, because I know of a couple of fields where they were having problems with the diseases, and by adjusting their fertility, they're being able to reduce the levels of the disease quite a bit. So very important to consider fertility. Um, you know, residue management is important because these two diseases, they overwinter in the straw. So you want to make sure to either, you know, decompose, burn, remove, uh, to help you reduce the disease level. And then we have fungicides available. Well, one fungicide. So for these two diseases, azoxystrobin, which is the active ingredient on Quadris, is the only registered fungicide that gives good control for both. We've done trials for several years now with several fungicides, and time and time again, azoxystrobin is the only one that affects both diseases. There's another fungicide, Excalia, and I've talked about this fungicide in the past. The active ingredient is Impicfluxam, gives excellent control of aggregate sheath spot, but that's the only disease that it works on. You know, it was going to be registered and available, you know, soon, but apparently there's been some issues with data, so it might be a while before we get this fungicide available. So for the application timing, we've done several years of trials looking at timing. There was a question earlier about maybe the propanil timing was a good timing for these two diseases because you can get down to the water level. Um, and over and over, our trials have shown that the propanil timing doesn't work very well. We don't get a lot of benefit. When we get good disease reduction is when we do mid boot to early heading. And so mid boot is when the panicle's still inside the boot, and it's maybe about a 4-inch panicle inside the boot. Um, and so we were interested in looking at this mid boot timing because, as you know, some fields have been having problems with kernel smut. The timing for application of propiconazole for control of kernel smut is the mid boot stage. So we wanted to see if we could combine or use that timing also for stem rot and aggregate sheath spot. And so that having that timing allows us to time mix and target both or the three diseases. Here's a couple of examples of trials. So this is for stem rot. You can see Quadris and Quadris at heading, 75% disease reduction. The other thing is we use also trifloxystrobin, which is the active ingredient Stratego, which is the other fungicide that's registered for rice. And we don't get as good result with trifloxystrobin for stem rot. This is for aggregate sheath spot. Again, Quadris, you know, very good disease reduction, 75% or more. Here's Quilt Excel, which is a mix of Quadris, and Tilt. So azoxystrobin has the same amount of azoxystrobin as Quadris, and with very similar control. And here's Excalia, the new fungicide for aggregate sheet spot, very good control as well at both stages, boot and heading. Stratego didn't give us very much, didn't give us any control for aggregate sheet spot. So azoxystrobin, which is the active ingredient in Quadris, we've been using this fungicide for almost 25 years now, and it's used in almost half of our acreage. So we have to be thinking about resistance. It's a fungicide that's has very high risk of resistance development because of a very specific mode of action. So what are some of the strategies to reduce the risk of resistance development? One is to reduce the number of seasonal applications. And so I think on that front, we're doing good. We usually just do 1 or 2 applications. The label says we can only do 2 on a season. There's other crops where they're doing up to 10, 12 applications per season. So that's a very high pressure for this resistance development. So we're good on this strategy. The other is to mix uh, with other active ingredients and to rotate. This is a problem for us because we don't have anything else. We only have azoxystrobin pretty much. It's recommended to use the fungicide preventively. Especially for blast, we can do this. The idea is to reduce the amount of inoculum that's out there. So if you use the fungicide after there's a lot of lesions, that means there's a lot of spores that are being produced, and it's just a numbers game. So the more spores out there, the more the chances of resistance development is higher. So you want to have the least amount of inoculum out there. So using the fungicide preventively works best.
Luis, you're running out of time, just as a heads up.
Okay, I have one more slide after this, and then the other strategy is to follow good agronomic practices to reduce disease development. The same, we want to reduce the amount of inoculum out there. And this is the last slide. There's been questions about smut and the use of bleach on the when we soak the seed, if that would help us with controlling smut. We did a study last year, and we don't see a reduction on spore germination when we bleach the seed. And so it doesn't look like using bleach really has much of an effect on smut. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there, and then we can jump to the poll questions, and they're right here. So I just have 3 questions. The first one is, what's the best timing of application for control of stem rot and aggregate sheet spot is early heading, mid boot to early heading, or the propanil timing? Question number 2, blast and stem rot are favored by application of extra nitrogen. And then question number 3, azoxystrobin, which is the active ingredient in Quadris, and trifloxystrobin, the active ingredient in Stratego, have different modes of action. And I'm over 3 minutes, so I'm gonna just jump to the results. And so, best timing for application of for control of stem rot and aggregate sheet spot, mid boot to early heading. Blast and stem rot are favored by extra nitrogen. That's true. And then azoxystrobin and trifloxystrobin are the same mode of action. So that would be have different modes of action. That's false. All right. And then if there's questions, I will look at them in the Q&A and go ahead and answer them.